My name's Stu Stover. I've been teaching economics for, it seems like, 40 years, and there's certain things that seem to be true. I tend to like to start my econ classes, particularly these days, with the subject of market failure. Market failure works both in micro and macro, so there's a lot of issues that in econ that work more on the micro side, more on the macro side, or they're just econ stuff. Market failure is one of those that is very much a generic concept. And one of the reasons that we focus on this right now is that market failures make the assumption that there's certain things about the capitalist system that capitalism-free markets don't necessarily solve real well. And so the question is, what are they, and what do we do about them? And so all sorts of political stuff every which way on this issue today, but I wanted to go through the basic 4 issues that we talk about in almost every econ textbook. I mean, so it doesn't really matter which textbook you're using, you're going to get a list something like this. And so the first one that I like to talk about is externalities. Okay. One of the things you get in econ is a ton of terminology. So we have lots of terms that are very specific to econ that you kind of got to understand if you're going to understand how econ works. So externalities is one of them. So externalities can be either positive or negative. All right, so let me give you a couple basic examples here of externalities. There's far too many. There's lots and lots of examples. But a negative externality, let's say 2 houses across the street from you go vacant. And the bank, for whatever reason, can't sell those houses and they start to deteriorate. What happens to the value of your house? Guess what? Your house is going to go down. And it may go down substantially. Did you do anything to cause that? Or did stuff just happen that caused the value of your house to go down? All right, so that's a pretty easy example of how a negative works. We'll talk about some other negatives in a second, but let's do a positive. Same example. Okay, somebody takes the empty lot across the street from your house and builds a $500,000 house. What happens to the value of your house? It goes up. What did you do to cause the value of your house to go up? Nothing. And so it's just something that happens outside your control is what an externality is. So let me give you a couple other of the standard examples. Pollution. Okay, so the classic example is if you were downstream of a city, what was the quality of water in your community from that particular river? Tons of examples. Civil War, Abraham Lincoln is living in Washington, D.C. You've got all these troops that are doing their business connected to the river right next to Washington, D.C. The quality of the water is truly awful, diseases, all sorts of things. So a negative externality is you happen to live downstream from somebody that may be polluting and causing harm to you. What did you do to cause that? Nothing. But it's just the nature of where you live and how all that stuff is connected. Let me give you another example of that. Grand Rapids. I love Grand Rapids, great city. Grand Rapids has historically been one of the communities that has the most number of ozone action days in the summer of any city in America. Okay, why is that? Does Grand Rapids produce lots of pollution that causes people with asthma and kids and old people to have to stay indoors in the summer? And the answer is no. They're downwind of Chicago. What does Chicago produce with the 3+ million people that you have in Chicago? Lots of exhaust, lots of other stuff, and the wind blows and it lands on Grand Rapids. So exactly how does Grand Rapids deal with that problem, that negative externality? I don't know. And So what we're arguing here is that from a free market system, there isn't necessarily a great solution to this problem. Now, we could go on and on with lots of other examples of negatives or positives, but at some level, when we get to the other side, we're going to talk about solutions real quick. What we're looking at is, can the government play a positive role to deal with externalities and some of the other market failures that we would talk about? The answer is sometimes. Sometimes not, but government has tended to be the answer in modern society to deal with some of these kinds of failures. All right, so let's move to the next one, public goods. Public goods is one of those issues. We have roads, we have schools, we have infrastructure, wastewater treatment plants. We have all of this infrastructure that people access whether they've actually paid into it or not. And so the idea is, by having all these public goods, the whole society benefits. And so one of the things we're talking about this is the balance between the needs of the individual and the needs of the whole, and trying to come up with some reasonable balance on that stuff. I'm of the opinion that I don't like the stark choices that we have frequently in society. It's either black or it's white or whatever, but it's the compromises in the way we make sense of public goods. So, we could take an issue like something like public parks, okay, or the national parks, because they're in essence free for everybody. Now, that's not completely true, because you got to pay a fee to get in. But if we were to turn those parks into private sector for-profit enterprises, how much would you pay to access those parks? Might be a whole heck of a lot, and we'd be excluding certain kinds of people from being able to access that. So one of the things we talk about here, for what it's worth, is that the free market system doesn't always value green space. Is green space important for humans? And the answer is probably. And so we tend to think of that as a public good, meaning that it's hard to recoup the cost of that if we were to put it into the free market system. The third one we talk about is something called asymmetric information. Okay, Wall Street is classic for this, but it can be lots of other arenas. You go in, and I'll use a simple example here, guys. Simple example, you go in to buy a new car. How much information does the salesperson have? How much do you have? Can you be taken advantage of? Of course, and that's one of the reasons you have rules on lemon laws and all sorts of other things to protect us, because they have information that we may not have. And is that particularly consequential on Wall Street? You bet. And particularly with some of the newer financial devices that are out there, the cryptos and the other stuff, we're talking about potentially very significant differences between what someone on the inside knows and what somebody on the outside doesn't know. And so we want to minimize the negative consequences on individuals from this asymmetric. And then the fourth one we talk about is something called market power. And market power, we Americans really struggle with this a bit. How much power do we want our corporations to have? And we talk about the oligarchs and the economic power that certain folks have in America. Now, this also gets into inequality and all sorts of other issues that we're not going to get into right now. But the issue is, if we've got a monopoly, what can they do? And the answer is they can do pretty much whatever they want. And so there's real downside issues, and we'll get to that later in the course in terms of how we think about monopolies and oligopolies and monopolistic competition and managed monopolies, all the various forms of managing companies that we have in a capitalist system. And so we tend to say that market power has great potential to do great harm. Also have great potential to do great good. So the questions there are always interesting about what do we do with all of these kinds of things. Now guys, there are lots more potential market failures beyond just these four. These are the four basic ones. And we will get into more detail with each of these as we go through the course. But let me just take a minute and get the other one here, is what are the fixes for market failures? And so typically, obviously, we historically have looked at the government to play some role. That's why we have the FCC and the FTC, and why we have the SEC and all these other agencies. Another one that is very much under fire at the moment, I mean, who knows what will happen down the road, but the Consumer Financial Protection Agency was an agency to protect the poorest of us Americans against the abuses of, corporates and banks and, whoever else is playing games with all of us. And so typically you had the government playing a more active role in sort of rounding off the edges of this stuff. So we're not talking about communism, we're not talking about destroying the free market system, we're just talking about rounding off the edges so it's not quite so harsh, maybe quite so consequential for folks who get caught in the crosshairs. I mean, we look at an issue like bankruptcies in this country, and the number one reason why people go bankrupt in this country is still medical debt. Why are we forcing people who've had cancer and heart disease and all the other things to declare financial bankruptcy as the solution to their problem? It seems like a nut strategy to me, but the government can and should play some role here. Are there private sector solutions? Well, yeah. Disney has been talking about buying some of the national parks. Okay, and so they would then turn it into a more for-profit enterprise. And is there anything wrong with some of that? Probably not. It's probably fine to allow private sector to do certain things. You've got, an extreme on this is we could go with private roads, and we have sold some of our roads to private companies as a way to maintain the roads and keep our system functioning. So there are private solutions out there on any of these issues. Public schools, private schools would be another example of that. And then frankly, what the third category, I don't exactly know what to describe this as, but new stuff. New technology shows up. So for what it's worth, Elon has said that we are going to eliminate 50% of the teachers in America in the near future. And maybe when you see this, some of that may actually be coming true. But the idea is we now have technology available that makes it easier to turn over the rote section of education to the computers and the AIs and all the other stuff. And you may not need as many teachers to facilitate some of that activity that's going on. So the short answer on all of this is market failures is an important piece of economics. We don't want to ignore the realities here, because this in particular drives microeconomics as we look at microeconomics. So we will pick this up in the next video. Thank you very much.